Hello, it is Saturday, the 2nd of March, sunny day. I'm reading extracts out of Speaking from the Heart, Joan Marshall Grant's book about ethics, reincarnation and what it means to be human. It was edited by Nicola Bennett, Jane Law and Sophia Rostov. And it is the story of her life. It was published in 2007 only, and there's things about her and from her in this book. And my last reading, chapter 10, the first reading, was muted because I didn't see the battery was empty. And I have realized that I didn't continue where it actually stopped. So I'm reading that again because I thought it was very interesting. She talks about it is only too commonplace, for instance, to see a man whose physical body has a plaster leg still limping even though he has shifted to a different level of activity during sleep. And this self-inflicted and utterly needless handicap may even persist after the body has died, death being a process similar to the slowing of a snake's skin, shedding of a snake's skin. This is the cause of a certain type of ghost. To avoid imposing this upon oneself, it is important to remain keenly aware that one has not only the upstairs and much better counterpart of one's present body available for use, but that with relatively little training, one can assume on any but the physical level any of the forms at any stage of the development of that form, which is contained in the long history of one's bodily series. This series, of course, includes bodies male and female belonging to many different races, and also the animal bodies selected by that particular spirit as a vehicle. Often its field of awareness has become wide enough to require the more complex brain of a human being through which to express itself. I know how easy it is to get carried along on the muddy current of materialistic thought. For only 5 years ago, I was temporarily the victim of this inept way of thinking. I had been helping to embalm the body of a great friend of mine who had died suddenly of a heart attack. The embalming, I must add, had no ritual significance and was performed merely because the funeral was delayed on account of a hold-up at the crematorium. That was what was missing in the last chapter. And I continue here the second reading of this lecture. This is Psychiatry and Past Lives. This is a lecture she gave, I think it's called the Tadworth Lecture. The ARE lecture. No, Some Aspects of Farm Memory. This is under the heading Some Aspects of Farm Memory. But to return to the stage of evolution which immediately affects all of us, what happens to the aspects of a personality which are not acceptable for integration with the spirit? I believe that these aspects become split off from the rest of the personality in exactly the same way as situations which we refuse to tackle during our current lifetime get crammed into the laundry bin which Freud calls the unconscious. If they have been put there in the present incarnation, we can rescue them by changing the attitude which caused us to thrust them out of sight. Attitudes such as a false pride, false humility and self-pity being among the most common causes of dirty linen, remaining unwashed until it causes sufficient nuisance to manifest as a neurosis. But if the dirty linen belongs to an earlier incarnation, the problem is rather more difficult. Eventually it has to be dealt with by a later personality in the same series, which has acquired the attitudes which the earlier personality lacked. A stuck personality can make itself currently felt by haunting a place until someone notices its presence and does something about it. Or it can affect a later personality with recurrent dreams, illogical ideas or neurotic symptoms. It is the stuck personality, the ghost if you prefer it, that is most likely to be contacted by drugs or excessive alcohol, and so should not be the subject of investigation except with expert help, or by a hypnotist who really knows what he is doing. Nothing intensifies the nuisance potential of a ghost so much, or makes it more despairing, than to find that even when it has at last been able to transmit an appeal for help, the appeal is ignored or distorted out of recognition, to make it conform to the theories of an analyst. It is in such cases that another aspect of farm memory can be of very real use. The aspect of being able to tune in to a stuck fragment of a previous personality of someone else. I can very seldom do this to order, but it sometimes occurs spontaneously when it is necessary to a patient's cure. I try to avoid knowing anything about anyone else's history, for I find this tends to confuse the real issue. It is not the person who they used to be, but the person who they are now. During the war, an eminent psychiatrist came to stay with me in Wales for the weekend, because he was interested, at least as a theory, in reincarnation, which he felt might be the true explanation of certain statements made by patients of his undergoing hypnoanalysis. He was more interested in reincarnation, but still far from convinced, until 10 minutes before he was due to leave the house. I handed him a brace of pheasants, usually a very acceptable gift when rationing was at its most stringent, but instead of taking them from me, he backed away looking very embarrassed. He then asked that the birds should be wrapped in a parcel instead of only having their necks tied together with a string. When I told him they could travel better unwrapped, he became rather agitated and exclaimed, "But I can't touch feathers." Within seconds of his remark, I heard myself saying, "That is because you died a similar death to one of mine. You were left for dead on a battlefield. I can't tell you when or where, but your skin is brown and the ground you're lying on is arid. There are a few outcrops of grey rock, but the rest is pale sand. There are 5 or 6 vultures watching you die. You can still manage to wave your arms, and each time you wave them, the vultures flap their wings and hop a little further away, but soon they hop back again. Now they are so close that you can smell them. They start tearing at your flesh before you are quite dead." At this point, my ex-husband stopped me, for the psychiatrist had collapsed onto the sofa and seemed exceedingly distressed. He gladly accepted our invitation to stay another night, and by the following morning he was not only convinced that he had died in the manner which I had described, but that he was at last freed from his obsessive terror of feathers. He had been exceedingly worried by this phobia, which I knew nothing about, and had been treated for it by several colleagues. But he had remained unable to rescue birds which became entangled in the strawberry nets, and vomited if he attempted to do so, which his children thought uproariously funny. In his bread and butter letter, I mentioned that he had hoped that none of the other occupants of this railway carriage knew that he was a psychiatrist, as he kept taking peasants down from the rack and fondling them, because he was so delighted with his ability actually to enjoy the sensation of touching feathers. Another type of stuck personality is exemplified by one I was able to assist while I was staying in Ireland in 1956. My host, having first taken me for a long and muddy walk, then on the pretext of fetching the Sunday papers, took me in his car to meet a house full of strangers, without giving me the opportunity to get remotely tidy. I had not even combed or a compact in my pocket, so I was disgruntled before we reached the house, and still more disgruntled when he led me into a large drawing room which was unoccupied except by an open coffin containing a corpse. I imagined this to be an exceptionally unfunny Irish joke, and remarked acidly that if his idea of a jolly Sunday morning was attending a wake, he might at least have allowed me to be more suitably dressed. The room was icy cold, but it seemed normal enough, as it was an Irish house in January. I had turned my back on the corpse and was trying to tidy my hair in the looking-glass above the fireplace, and there was a blazing fire when my host said, "If you wish to find out why you are shivering, touch one of the radiators," which I did, and found that it was painfully hot. So I glanced over my shoulder, and where the coffin had been, I saw a perfectly ordinary chintz-covered sofa. But in the corner of the room I could see an elderly man staring at the place where a minute or two earlier I had seen his corpse, lying in the coffin. At this juncture, my host dashed into the hall and shouted, "Come down, all of you, Joan has seen the ghost." Most people are more annoyed if you mention that their house is haunted, usually on the grounds that it will upset the servants, than if you remark that there is obviously something seriously wrong with the drains. However, this family was different, for including a great-aunt of 93 who tottered down from her eyrie in one of the towers to the youngest child aged 5, they had all seen the ghost. The ghost was an unusual one, in that he had a plump and aged spaniel sitting faithfully at his feet. This spaniel was the only living thing he had ever loved, and who had ever loved him. The dog's master had been a fervent atheist. He was so firmly convinced that he could have no existence after he was dead, that he had been frozen in horror at the realization that there was an aspect of himself which could actually see his body lying in his coffin. Usually I am able to make the ghost see me and then hold a conversation with him until he accepts the fact that he would have more fun rejoining his spirit than fussing about the triviality that his physical body is dead. But on this occasion it was the spaniel who first noticed me, and the man accepted me, because I had been recognized as a friend by his dog. They both stayed very happily in that house for several months and formed genuine links of affection with the whole family. My hostess told me some weeks later that several visitors had been disconcerted by seeing the family dogs romping with another one, which, to the visitors, was invisible. The family dogs had drawn attention to the ghost by scratching at the drawing room door, which was usually kept locked. I presume they wished to assist the ghost spaniel to melt the frigid materialism, which was keeping its master almost literally in a deep freeze. I must mention that the temperature of the room, if registered by a thermometer, would have been perfectly normal. The spooky cold, to use a family expression, would have been felt only by people who had some degree of extrasensory perception. This is why the room was seldom used, because the perceptive occupants shivered while the others sweated. The psychiatrist who suffered from a phobia of feathers is a good example of how a fragment of an earlier personality may require assistance from a later one. But in case there is anyone here who imagines that the formation of a ghost causes other aspects of the total personality to be unable to incarnate, I had better say a little more about the ghost in the Irish drawing room. So far as the owner of the house was able to discover, the ghost must have been there for about 120 years. During that period, his spirit must have initiated at least one, probably 2 or 3 personalities. There was almost certainly a current one, when I saw him, who was being sufficiently helpful to another human being for someone, in this instance me, to be directed to his assistance. The effect of my efforts on his current personality may have been a spontaneous cure of symptoms, such as attacks of shivering or an undue sensitivity to cold, or they may have relieved him from a fear of being buried alive. I think that several other members of that household could have released him just as effectively as I did, for they had both the perception and the goodwill, but, as they admitted when I asked them, they thought it would be presumptuous for them to even try. They were Roman Catholics and had already employed a priest to hold a service of exorcism in the room, but this had produced no effect. A ghost, like everyone else, is seldom affected by empty ritual, and infinitely prefers being approached with a compassionate attempt at understanding by an amateur than with a chilly, though professional, technique. So when you feel there may be a ghost present, but put yourself as intimately in tune with your own spirit as possible. The most effective way of doing this is to think intensely for a few minutes about people you genuinely love. Then ask to be provided with further information. If this is not available in your personal source of wisdom, then treat the ghost as you would treat anyone else who is in distress, talking to him aloud or in thought, whichever seems the most natural. Should you find yourself sitting on a ghost's lap in a crowded restaurant, as I once did in the grill room of the Savoy Hotel in London, it is better to have a companion who can warn if you talk too loudly, otherwise you're liable to startle the waiters. This ghost was feeling exceedingly lonely, for there had been no guest at his table, so I sent out an urgent call for his friends to come to share it with him. In a couple of minutes 6 of them turned up, and to me seemed so solid that I was surprised that no one else saw them. Only when I was leaving the restaurant did I notice that there was a small brass plaque on the pillar immediately behind my chair. On it was inscribed, "This table was regularly used by Charles Frohman for many years up to 1915. I suppose it was a kind of heaven for a fragment of his personality, for, as I later discovered, he did not die there, but was drowned on the Lusitania. Suicide is supposed to result in this personality becoming a ghost, but whether it does so or not depends upon the motive. A fragment of one of my earlier personalities became stuck for a couple of thousand years after a suicide, because it was congealed in fury. My husband will remember that particular recall only too vividly, because he received a full blast of the rage I had been storing up against one of his earlier personalities. We were both Romans. When we met, I was 40, and as he was considerably younger than I was, I thought the best way of ensuring future meetings was to appoint him as my personal physician. I was a healthy and handsome woman, but I found it easier to blame the scribes for writing illegibly than to admit that my eyesight was less good than it used to be, and I was beginning to lose some of my excellent teeth. So I decided that no time must be wasted, and in the hope that my physician would realize how much he would miss me if I were to die, I staged an elaborate pseudo-suicide. Having caused a marble sarcophagus to be carved, I invited my acquaintances to a farewell banquet. This was thought mildly eccentric, but it was socially acceptable, for in those days any self-respecting Roman was expected to fall on his sword at the drop of a laurel wreath. Having made a splendid valedictory speech, which moved many of the more sentimental or drunken guests to tears, I withdrew to prepare myself for the death scene, and I am confidently assumed would be curtailed most delightfully. Having arranged myself in my sarcophagus, now filled with warm-scented water, I remember thinking that when it had served its immediate purpose, it would make a charming bath. I summoned my physician. Imperiously, I ordered him to open the veins in my wrists, and I waited for him to implore me to remain alive, so that he could lavish upon me his passionate devotion. But instead, he obeyed me implicitly. I could not have been more horrified if he had murdered me in cold blood. Pride would not allow me to implore him to apply tourniquets, so I had to lie there watching the water turn pink, and then pinker, and then red. At last I shut my eyes so I would not see, as he did many incarnations later, that they were blind with rage. I am now exceedingly grateful to that Roman physician for having had the insight, the compassion, and the moral courage to call my bluff. For the suicides which really land one in trouble are those undertaken as blackmail, and he cured me of any temptation again to use such a very dirty psychological weapon. It is usually exceedingly foolish to commit suicide, for it intensifies rather than solves most problems, because the motive for suicide is very seldom a good one. Either it is a desperate but ineffective method of trying to escape from a situation which could be resolved if only one had the courage to face it squarely, or it is the result of the mistaken belief that death leads to oblivion. But I'm sure that there are circumstances in which one must be prepared to take full responsibility for ending an incarnation. If I were to become incurably diseased or crippled in a way which prevented me from giving any happiness to other people, especially if my symptoms made nursing me an unpleasant task, I should consider it my duty to release myself from my physical body. I would treat it, in fact, with the same compassion as I have used when the bodies of dogs I have loved had ceased to be a useful vehicle for their personality. Medical science has advanced to a point where it can keep a physical body ticking over, often to the extreme distress of the psyche, when it should have already been discarded. In cultures where instinct was less likely to be observed by intellect than it is today, people knew how to leave their bodies which had become an encumbrance to their psyches. They could do so because they knew that death was a phase they had often experienced, and they had not even heard of the hearsay that pain is inflicted by the deity or that there is any virtue in suffering. A knowledge of reincarnation can free us from the fear of death, but it does not and should not free us from the fear of being a burden on other people. And this burden cannot be lifted from our shoulders until every patient has the right to ask for the means by which to ease himself out of a physical body which is no longer of any use to him or anyone else. As the primary purpose of any incarnation is to contribute to the wisdom of the spirit, I will now talk about a basic error which must be steadfastly avoided if this purpose is to be effectively accomplished. This error is blind obedience and blind disobedience, which is exactly the same cardinal mistake seen from the viewpoint of someone who is standing on his head. Most of us are alert to the dangers of brainwashing, yet many people fail to realize that our intellects are constantly being gyrated in brainwashing machines, in the form of newspapers, radios, television, and advertising, to mention only a few of them. This makes it difficult for us to think for ourselves, and we become so habituated to swallowing other people's opinions without even tasting them, that most of us do not know what we really think about anything. People who betray their individuality by becoming blindly obedient and who seek to escape from personal responsibility by submerging themselves in a group have, throughout history, always been more cruel, more stupid, more regressive than they would have ever been if they had cherished their hard-won uniqueness. It is quite suitable for a zebra to think of itself as part of a herd, but it is most unbecoming for a man to behave like a zebra. It is not only unbecoming, it is very much worse, for there is no more futile method of wasting our potentialities and our time than by doing something merely because one has been ordered to do it by somebody else. For by expending energy in blind obedience, we engage ourselves in one of the few activities which lead to losing on both the roundabouts and the swings. For you cannot dodge the responsibility of a malign action by protesting that someone else had ordered you to do it. And a still more cogent point, you cannot increase the strength of your spirit except by an action which you have instigated. Why do you think there is a world problem of juvenile delinquency? It has arisen because the individuals who are at present in young physical bodies have at last found the guilt caused by their blind obedience to be intolerable. So they are being blindly disobedient. But this phase will continue only until they discover that there is a third direction between these two miserable extremes, the benign direction of personal integrity. Groups are always in opposition. If this were not so, the members would all belong to the same group and be seeking another one to fight against. Love can exist only between individuals, which is why the civilization of the individual has been the fount of all real civilizations. The streamlined barbarism in which we find ourselves is becoming too sad even for the materialists to live in. So let us constantly remember that only by learning how to love more and how to be more lovable shall we be able to civilize the asphalt jungle of the 20th century. Okay, this is the end of this particular lecture. The next one is entitled The Body-Soul Duality, and that will be my next reading. Still chapter 10.